This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
Fundraisers love it, right? If you sort a discovery list by RFM score and engagement score, and you take people with high figures in both of those scores, those are your best discovery visits.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Shelby Radcliffe, Vice President for Advancement at Willamette University. Hello, Shelby. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Hi, Jen. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I am so excited to have you here to talk about your work. But before we jump into data and using it to implement fundraising strategies, I'm wondering if you'd share a little bit about your career, because it wasn't until I was preparing for this interview that I realized that you had an unusual, dare I say historic, career trajectory, because you went from prospect research to running the department. I mean, it's like a dream for some of us. President, it's a big deal. How did that happen?
Oh, well, I won't say that it was entirely intentional, certainly not at first. So after about 9 years of doing social work and working in small nonprofits, really managing volunteers and doing direct service to clients, I started a job at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and it was an entry-level prospect researcher position. I did not know anything about prospect research before I applied for the job. And I thought of it at the time as I wanted to work at a college, and I would get any job I could at a college and learn about what it was like to work at a college, and then probably have to go to graduate school to pursue whatever it was that I wanted to do. I wound up staying in development for 15 years at Bucknell, so obviously it was a great, happy accident. And over time, I just had the opportunity to expand my set of responsibilities at Bucknell, and I also served on the APRA board, which gave me a ton of leadership experience as well. So by the time I left Bucknell, I was executive director of campaign administration, which basically meant all of the non-fundraising and non-alumni relations units reported to me. So donor relations, gift processing, advancement services, prospect research. And then also I was the campaign director. So we didn't have a full-time campaign director. So I was that person who worked with the vice president to develop the entire operational strategy for the campaign that Bucknell entered around 2007, which at the time was it was a $500 million campaign. So I was very happy at Bucknell. It's an extraordinary place to work. They gave me tons of opportunity to learn and grow, but it was a town of 7,000 people, and I had never really had an adventure professionally or personally of leaving my home region of the Mid-Atlantic and living somewhere exciting. And I was starting to get inquiries from places about a variety of AVP style jobs, and I was taking those seriously and talking to institutions. And over time, I was honing in on the UK and also the West Coast, vastly different parts of the world, places where I thought I could live and have the opportunity to travel and see those areas and regions. And I got recruited for an AVP job at Occidental College. And it was an exciting interview and it was a wonderful opportunity. But in the end, what they wanted me to fix was more than that AVP had the power to fix. They wanted me to change how fundraisers manage their portfolios, but the fundraisers were not going to report to that position. And so I declined the offer, and 9 months later, they called me up and said, our VP is retiring. We were really intrigued by you. Would you come back and talk to us about being our VP? And at that point, I hastily called all of my friends and colleagues who had become vice presidents that I knew and said, oh no, what do I do? This was not part of my plan. Should I even consider this? And in the end, obviously I did. And it was an extraordinary opportunity. And they really wanted someone to operationalize their fundraising program. So my background prepared me really well for that. Then after 4 years there, we were preparing to propose a campaign to their board. And I knew I wasn't going to stay in LA for the rest of my career. I really loved the adventure of living in LA, and I liked living on the West Coast, but I knew that LA wasn't home for me. And so I started being open to other conversations with other institutions, and Willamette was among the institutions that had reached out to me. And I knew of it through various connections over the years, and it was just a really great fit. And so a little over 4 years ago, I moved to Willamette. So yeah, very unexpected for me, for sure.
That's wonderful. I love it how you were just, you told them no, and then they come back with a better job. And it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? It's
Yeah,
real life.
I do find that, presidents and board chairs and the kinds of people who are thinking about the vice president role now understand that data and information is an important way to move the needle for their operation. They also know they need their vice president to be a leader by example and a fundraising officer and someone who can manage a portfolio. So they're looking for both of those skill sets. And I mean, Oxy really did take a chance on me because I had, for several years, I'd been raising my salary or more in annual fund gifts. That became my goal about halfway into my time at Bucknell. I had solicited and closed a few major gifts from campaign volunteers who were really committed to the institution, and those gifts were not necessarily hard for me to close, but I at least had been the person who'd been stewarding them through that process. And of course, I'd been in hundreds of hours of strategy meetings on top prospects at Bucknell over the years. And so I felt like I knew the rule book and the playbook, but I didn't have a lot of experience actually closing those gifts. And so Oxy took that chance on me, and I had the opportunity to close my first $1 million gift, my first $5 million gift, to bring donors into the fold who had not been donors at all, to take people who were past donors but a little unhappy, to bring them back to the institution. And I felt like I got to prove to myself that I really knew what I was doing. But I would give that advice to anyone from the operations and data side who thinks that that kind of leadership role is in their future. Give them the advice that they do have to start asking for money earlier in their career than they might think if they want that. That's still a really important part of the job. But you can skip over having a whole major prospect portfolio if you want to. You don't necessarily have to be a full-time major gift officer to be the VP. It's actually easier to be the VP if you've not been a full-time major gift officer than it is to be the DOD, because the DOD really needs to be able to be in there with their fundraisers, advising on strategy day in and day out.
Wow. Who knew? That is great intel for people
Yeah.
looking to chart their careers. That's fabulous. There's hope.
Yeah.
Well,
and I never thought this was what I wanted either. So, I mean, it's amazing how you change your mind. So if there are prospect researchers and advancement services strategists and people like that out there who are listening, don't shut your mind to the possibility. You may find that eventually the lure of being in charge and getting to see if it works the way you imagine it could, that might be tempting. So push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit and see if you might be good at it, because I think many of our colleagues in that part of our world would be very surprised at how fun it is.
Aha. There's a secret. There's a secret side to it. I would agree with you if you can step outside. But you've overlooked something. You have done a lot of hard work. And that's how I found you, because I stumbled onto your master's thesis. It was about alumni engagement and its relationship to giving behaviors. And we had just had a masterclass at the Institute on that topic, and we're asking that question. So it was like perfect timing. But what struck me was how easy it was to read. I felt like I was walking through the project with you, and it just seemed so doable. I'm curious, how did the project come together, and what did you learn from that experience?
Well, I think the idea for the project evolved out of a few things. First, Bucknell was a place where, it's a fairly small institution. It probably has 50 to 60,000 living alumni now. It's a place where we feel like we know our alumni because we work closely with our alumni volunteers, and there's several hundred alumni that we know really well. But Bucknell, like so many other places, had fallen into the habit of, when they wanted to understand who their alumni were, instead of doing surveys, they just turned to their closest friends, the alumni volunteers who were so active and loved the place. And they made assumptions about the entire alumni base based on what those people said. And of course, what those of us who do anything with statistics, even casually, know is that those folks are your outliers. Those people are probably the least representative of your alumni population in their attitudes and behaviors of any other group. and they're wonderful and you appreciate them, but what they want and what they need is often not actually true. So when I started looking at the data and comparing it to what the alumni board or others might say, there was a mismatch there. Another thing that often happened at Bucknell was we would be in some meeting with teams from across campus, and it wouldn't even necessarily be about advancement. And someone in the group would say, we can't change X because donors will stop giving, or we can't change Y because these categories of alumni will be upset. And at that point, I was the steward of the database, right? So technically, anyone who wanted to ask questions of our alumni database had to go through me. And I would say things like, how do you know that? And they wouldn't be able to answer me. Have we done a survey that shows that? And these were important university decisions. Decisions about athletics programs, decisions about Greek life, decisions about traditions at Bucknell that had in some cases become sort of unhealthy and dangerous for students. And, oh, we can't possibly consider not having this particular event because people will be upset. And every time I asked that question, no one could answer how they knew it. They just felt that it was true. So I really wanted to test the question of whether, is it true that our Greek alumni actually give more than our non-Greek alumni? Is it true that our athlete alumni give more than our non-athlete alumni? People had all of these assumptions. And as the owner of the database, I think it just perturbed me a bit that people were making assumptions without asking the questions. And I really came to this way of thinking. I have to give a lot of credit to Lawrence Henze and Josh Burkholz and Marion Pelletier, people who had done presentations at APRA workshops and case conferences where I was exposed to this way of thinking. I was an English major, so I was not someone who ever had significant statistics training or background, but I understood the concepts well enough to know that I had to ask the question of the data. So once I started trying to ask the questions of the data, I had one tool, and that was alumni survey data. And we actually had a fair amount of it at Bucknell, but we hadn't been terribly consistent in asking questions over the years, and we hadn't also asked the questions that I wanted to answer. So I started looking for a way to relate giving to other attitudes and behaviors. And at the same time was talking to people like Josh and Lawrence and a gentleman named Peter Wiley about engagement scores. And could you actually codify in the same way an RFM score codifies people's giving behavior over a period of time? Could you codify engagement based on actions, not just based on how people say they feel? And so the idea for creating an engagement score at Bucknell was born. And after many, many discussions about how to do it, we moved forward with the project that became my master's thesis, which was a predictive model based on appended data and existing data that we had that looked at a group of highly and moderately and low engaged alumni and identified the things that made them fall into those categories, and then developed a very complicated scoring system to give people a score across the whole database. And then I was able to study, do these people actually behave differently as far as giving is concerned? And of course, what I found was no, there was absolutely no benefit as far as giving behavior to being a Greek alumnus or an athletic alumnus. It was really about capacity, and it was about overall engagement, which is a feeling, and that can come from being part of an a cappella group or having a favorite professor, and that these large categories of activity, Greek life and athletics participation, were not more or less powerful than other types of engagement that an alumnus could have either as a student or as a volunteer post-graduation. So it was very powerful for me to say, no, we shouldn't make decisions based on that assumption because it is in fact untrue. And it also wound up helping us to target our alumni programming in a totally different way, which has been how I've used it more as a vice president, both at Occidental and at Willamette. And I left Bucknell shortly after we developed the score, and I would probably do things, I have done things differently now. So I wouldn't necessarily redo the project in exactly the same way, but I learned what I needed to learn to be able to then go forward and do something similar again.
Well, because I'm dying to know, how did people respond? I mean, here you were saying, no, that's not true, and I've got the data to prove it. Like, was that embraced?
Yeah.
Was there defensive? What happened?
Well, I would say that the best response actually came from the alumni board. We had a volunteer summit that would bring a lot of the key volunteers from volunteer groups. They had an arts association and a bison club and the alumni board itself. And I did probably a 90-minute presentation and discussion on the data and what I found with those groups. And I think the message of you are an outlier in the most extraordinarily positive way was very well received. So it was a really positive thing to say to them, while I was also saying, and that means you don't know what your other alumni think, feel, and do. So I sort of wrapped the negative of, you don't really understand your alumni population, in this positive of, because you're so extraordinary. And I have a Bucknell family. I have quite a few people, not myself until graduate school, but I have quite a few people who went to Bucknell in my life. So I've seen them since. And one of them was on the alumni board at the time. And when I run into him, he still tells that story of that was his aha moment as a volunteer. And they started being much more open to data-driven plans for how to build engagement programs. And so the alumni team, I'd like to think this played a big part in allowing that team to pivot towards intentional engagement strategy, as opposed to just reacting to some really passionate volunteer who wanted to build a whole alumni program around something, whatever that was, the chess club. And that really wasn't where Bucknell should be putting its time and energy. And I'll say that at both Oxy and Willamette, that same message has been very, very powerful and useful, because so often we're reacting to our alumni board and our alumni volunteers, and instead of working with them to implement plans that are strategic. And so I think it made a great difference there. My fantasy for using this extended beyond that at Bucknell, and I left before I was able to really steward its implementation, but I wanted to do things like evaluate the long-standing events that we had and see if they were all as productive and useful as we might have thought. Do we really need to do 17 of these every year? Could we do 5 of them and be as effective? Are we getting the same people? Are we moving people forward in the engagement score through this event, or is it just reinforcing engagement? What are we doing to pull people in with maybe a low to medium score to get them higher? How are we finding new volunteers using this data, people who are sort of virtually raising their hands and saying, pick me, but we don't see them because we don't see the data that way. We just know who we know, and we know who their friends are. I feel really good about where we're going at Willamette now, and we have developed an undergraduate engagement score, and we're working on finessing and finalizing a graduate student engagement score, graduate alumni engagement score here. So I feel better, especially being in the vice president's role. I have more power and influence to say to the alumni team, this is how I want you to use this information. And I've, been able to hire AVPs who really get it and really support that. And it's not a battle. Not that it was a battle at Bucknell, but I was the one who was really passionate about it. And yet the alumni team didn't really work directly with me. Fundraisers love it, right? If you sort a discovery list by RFM score and engagement score, and you take people with high figures in both of those scores, those are your best discovery visits. So fundraisers don't always realize that the research office is using those tools, but it definitely helps to build much better discovery activity from your portfolio.
It helps you raise more money. That's for sure.
I think so. I mean, we should never ignore the really wealthy people who have absolutely no engagement, right? We should always, every institution has a line. For us at Willamette, it's $1 million. At Bucknell, it might be 5. At Harvard, it might be 100 million. But everyone has a line above which you should pay attention to them regardless of what their giving, their past giving, or their engagement score looks like, at least until you discover how to get in the door and see if they're inclined. Because there are people at a certain level of wealth where they're not going to be engaged gently or slowly, but then once you talk to them about the big idea, they're going to get very excited. So, but below that, it's an amazing tool for prioritizing staff time and energy, for sure.
What a great story. Thank you for sharing.
Sure, you're welcome.
Before I let you go, though, I'm wondering if you have any last tips for prospect researchers who might be listening and who might want to sort of follow in your footsteps to a leadership position.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I think maybe along the lines of 2 things. First, when it comes to doing things like RFM scores and engagement scores, as much as you can get very excited about using R and SPSS and all kinds of other tools to do something really sophisticated, The harder it is to translate what the score means and how it was developed to your colleagues who are doing the relational work, the less likely it is to get implemented and embraced. So, an RFM score that just simply gives points for the number of gifts they've given in a year, in a 15-year period, or gives points for gifts of a certain size, like that's not maybe as statistically predictive, and it's maybe not as strong, but it's so much easier for a fundraising colleague to understand. They're much more likely to use it. And the same is true for an engagement score. So I've actually moved away from more complicated scoring models and towards simpler scoring models for that reason. And I think the more you can make your work meaningful and visible to the fundraising team when you're on the operations side, the more they can see you as a thought leader and as a person who really understands strategy. And so we have to put ourselves in their shoes and think to the extent that we can like a fundraiser, like a person who's planning a trip. And I guess that segues into my second piece of advice, which is we have to put ourselves in their shoes. Even if your ultimate career goal is to be the director of a prospect research and management unit, which is an extraordinarily satisfying and wonderfully productive career. If that's your career goal, traveling with fundraisers and doing solicitations and sitting with fundraisers while they're planning their trip and sitting with fundraisers and watching them look at the database as they're preparing for a visit, those things will help you be a better director of prospect research and management or a better director of advancement services, even if you never aspire to being an AVP or a VP for advancement. But you can't become an AVP or a VP for advancement if you don't do those things. You really have to understand what it's like to be in a cab in New York City, going from visit to visit, having to look at all the information on a smartphone to refresh your memory because you're trying to see 15 people in 4 days and it's all getting jumbled in your brain. And what you want to be able to do is look at some specific piece of information and it's really hard to find. And if you just had a briefing in a Word document as opposed to having to look in Banner or Razor's Edge or whatever database you use, it would be right there at your fingertips. Sort of understanding some of the ways that felt old-fashioned or frustrating to me as a researcher, but understanding why those things become important and meaningful for the person who's actually the one doing the fundraising. I'll never forget when I was running the research office at Bucknell, I asked a major gift director how he was doing. And we were in the last year of a $150 million campaign for Bucknell at the time. And he said, my head is in a vice and I feel like the vice president comes and turns it a little tighter.
Ouch.
And it really took me back and just made me think, wow, I work hard and I feel pressure because I have high expectations for myself, but no one's going to fire me if I don't raise a certain amount of money. The pressure that those in that position feel is real, and the challenges of that work are real. And the more we understand them, really open our minds to understanding them and experience them, the better we can customize how we support and lead from a perspective of data-informed strategy. And the more, when we do that, we will get asked to be out in front of a project instead of in the middle of a project or behind the project. So again, that's that sort of getting out of your comfort zone. Even if you think, I don't ever want to ask people for money, doing it to some degree will teach you things you could never learn just by watching someone else do it. And it will make you better at whatever it is you do.
Fabulous advice. I really appreciate your time today, Shelby. Thank you.
Sure. You're most welcome. It's a great pleasure. I'm honored.
That was Shelby Radcliffe, Vice President for Advancement at Willamette University. And if you're curious about her master's thesis on alumni engagement and its relationship to giving behaviors at Bucknell University, you can find it easily on Google if you do a search, or I'll have a link to it in the podcast blog post. It really is a good read on problem solving with data. Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come check out the Prospect Research Institute's learning community. It's a membership community with powerful resources, great discussions, and comprehensive courses. Check it out at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I'd love to have you join me as a member of the learning community. See you there.